Thank you. My name's Jared Ball. I'm the Chief Economist at the Committee for Economic Development of Australia, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here for the Treasurer's Panel lunch. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Ngunnawal people, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. Now, we are nearing the finish line, and I hope you've taken a little bit of optimism from Chris Richardson's presentation on the economy. But what discussion of the state of the nation would be complete without some perspectives from state government? If Australians are to be truly connected to opportunities and progress, then we must have the right infrastructure, health, education, justice and a range of services that state governments provide. So I'm very glad that today we can welcome the Honourable Dominic Perrottet MP, New South Wales Treasurer, the Honourable Tim Pallas MP, Victorian Treasurer. It's also fantastic to have CEDA's Chair-elect Diane Smith-Gander AO with us for today's discussion. Unfortunately, the West Australian Treasurer, Ben Wyatt, was unable to make the trip across for today's function. He wanted to be here, but unfortunately urgent parliamentary business prevented that from happening. I'm glad to report that in his absence we do have a very strong West Australian contingent at this year's conference, which Melinda mentioned earlier, so I'm sure they will ask plenty of questions in this session. A subtle reminder here to my right that if you want to tweet during today's session, that would be fantastic. If you could do that with your phones on silent, that would be even better. I'd now like to introduce our facilitator for today's discussion. Damien Graham is the Chief Investment Officer for First State Super. And as you would see from the bios in the app, he has a long and distinguished career in investment management. But even better for us today, he has a fantastic knack for extracting valuable insights from state treasurers on the CEDA stage. So please join with me in welcoming Damien to the stage.
Well, thanks, Jared. And again, what a great pleasure to be able to introduce and also host the Treasurers in a conversation today, which I'm sure will lead us in many different directions. It has been interesting to do this the last couple of years where there has been some quotes I will remember, but I won't reference them now. I did want to obviously also just add, from my perspective, acknowledge and pass on the respects for elders past, present and emerging for the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today. So First State Super, you will have heard a little bit yesterday with our CEO Deanne Stewart touching on some of the things that are important from our fund's perspective. But certainly when we think about the economy and what is critically important to delivering very good long-term returns to our members, the health of state economies is really critical to that. We were born and bred in New South Wales, but now have a very large footprint in Victoria as well. And so the health of New South Wales and Victoria from a state perspective is critical to the delivery of those returns. I think importantly also, our members expect us not just to generate good long-term returns, but they also expect us to do that in a really high integrity and responsible fashion. And so they really want us to be responsible owners of the assets in which we invest in and work well with different organisations and collaborate well across the economy to deliver those good long-term returns. And so interacting well with state governments is critically important to that long-term goal. And it certainly has been my pleasure to interact with both Dominic and Tim through time with regard to taking a long-term view to how we will generate returns, because again, it's very clear from our perspective that both of these gentlemen do share in that very good long-term focus in how they're going to grow their economies to make sure that we share the prosperity that we've talked about this morning and create also that fairness. So what I will do now is welcome both Tim and Dominic to the stage. And it is my great pleasure to welcome, obviously, the Treasurer of Victoria, Tim Pallas, and the Treasurer of New South Wales, the Honourable Dominic Perrottet. So please, gentlemen, take a seat. So again, both Dominic and Tim need very little introduction, but I will share some thoughts just on their background. So starting with Tim, so by way of introduction, and again, they really do not need much, but Tim has been the Treasurer of Victoria, sorry, that was almost a slip, of Victoria since 2014, and joined Parliament in 2006 as the Labor member for Werribee. It was the Treasurer wasn't a big enough job, and at the 2018 election he added the portfolios of development, economic development and industrial relations to his day job. So quite an amazing amount of activity I'm sure he has to cover. The most recent budget that Tim brought to Parliament was the fourth state budget, producing another strong surplus. And again, I think that really does reflect the great work that the Victorian government's been able to do in bringing that or maintaining that very strong fiscal position, and also reflecting the fact that Victoria has continued to really escalate its stance nationally, where it now obviously leads on a number of key metrics with regard to those across the nation. So obviously well done, Tim, and your team. Dominic's a slightly newer Treasurer, but nonetheless very experienced, and has been the Treasurer of New South Wales since 2017. Dominic entered Parliament in 2011, and he was originally the member for Hawkesbury, representing the Liberal Party, and more recently the seat of Epping in Sydney. Again, a very, very significant day job, but Dominic's been experienced across a number of different portfolios, having covered in the past finance, services and property, before becoming the Treasurer, a couple of years ago. Again, almost another slip. Again, another fantastic budget was recently announced by Dominic as a Treasurer, boasting a surplus. Again, I think that represents how strong fiscally New South Wales is positioned, and I'm sure we'll touch on that today with regard to the opportunities and the real breadth of things that both Victoria and New South Wales can do in bringing that fiscal strength to bear to create that prosperity and that fairness that we were just hearing about in a prior session. Now, I must admit, Dominic, as impressive as the fiscal position New South Wales has, I'm more in awe of you for recently obviously having your sixth child, which again I think is an amazing nation-building piece of focus. So with that, what we wanted to do, or what I wanted to do, and helping the Treasurers to do this, is just have a conversation over the next 20 or 30 minutes, and that after that time we'll break for some lunch. And we will come back after that break with the opportunity for questions from the floor. As always, there's an app which you can provide or input some questions which we can source, but also there'll be a roving mic that people can ask from the floor. So I'll kick off with some thoughts. So gentlemen, hopefully that's on, hopefully everyone can hear. What I did want to start with, and we've had a lot of conversation this morning and also over the last day or so, about trust, about purpose, about the need for a social compact with regard to lots of different organisations, but certainly government as well. And I just wanted to test with you both how you personally think about that, the job that your governments play in the ability for organisations, the broader society to really start to recapture that trust and the social compact that you think your governments are required to provide in societies that you're so impactful upon. Maybe starting with you, Tim.
Oh, okay, I was going to demur to the senior state, but look, I suppose that the real challenge for politics is to reconnect into the community, and there's this ever-increasing level of scepticism that politicians are there simply to occupy the crease and to not really do much. I can't tell you, there aren't many people I've met in public life who go into politics simply to be there. We have all differing views about what a future society should look like, but nobody is really there simply to occupy the crease, as it were. So from my perspective, it's reconnecting with the community in the most obvious way, and that is delivering things that materially improve their circumstances, and demonstrating that the political divide is not a chasm which can't be bridged. It's really a place where ideas can be tested, and it's a crucible of debate that between governments particularly, not necessarily at a intrastate level where your opponents are obvious to you, they're the people who sit opposite you in the parliament, but between governments it's about the practical day-to-day delivery of services for states, infrastructure, but it's also about recognising that you can make all the excuses in the world about why you failed to do what you said you'd do, and all that will do is increase a level of scepticism that the community holds us in. So we have to collectively make an effort to see that we can resource our own agendas, but support each other in resourcing their agendas, because ultimately the nation is stronger, the better performing governments are.
Yeah, Damien, I think governments and politicians aren't immune like other institutions, and there's a general trust deficit, I think, that's out there. And I think to Tim's point, it's not just about telling people what they want to hear, it's about being upfront and honest with the community about what the government's about and what you want to achieve. And if you do that and you're clear about what you believe in, and you're not there just to stay at the crease, you don't get into politics. I think I said this yesterday when I was with Tim, that just to win elections, it's the judgment that's most important is 10, 20, 30, 40 years down the track, that people look back at the time that you served and the opportunity that you had, that you actually set the state up for success. And that means, I think, if you're talking about building trust in government, is where you've got it wrong, or you've made a mistake, or you've come out with a project that you think was the right way to go, or a timeline that you wanted to stick to that doesn't necessarily work out, that you have the humility to sit there and say, well, this is what we intended on doing, we've looked at a better way of doing it, and we're going down this path. Whereas I think there's the sense of having a backflip here becomes a bit of a concern for politicians, rather than actually, I think what you want more with governments and politicians is a greater level of risk-taking, a greater openness, and also taking the community with you on what can be difficult policy. And sometimes from the outset, I think I look at our elections, particularly if you look back at the 2015 election, where we took the poles and wires to the election, which had been tried and failed many times before. We were very upfront with the public about what the government was going to do. And whilst that might not have been a popular policy, by saying, well, this is what you have now, but this is what it's going to unlock, so we can build this infrastructure, and it's going to be the benefit to the community. I think you can take people on the journey with you. It doesn't mean they're going to agree with you on everything, but as long as they sit there and say, well, at least they say it as they see it, I think that can help build trust in all institutions, including government.
That's a really interesting point, this myth of infallibility of politicians, and the greatest...
Not perfect, Tim?
Some might make that case, and I think I could probably, from a fair degree of experience, say, no, I've made a few mistakes along the road, and this idea that politicians are infallible, it's basically created by politicians who don't ever want to admit that they've made a mistake. Now, who amongst us hasn't made a mistake? Well, apart from Premier Daniel Andrews, of course, but everybody else, they're struggling. But the thing that I'd say is we've got to get to a position where we can have a mature, a genuine engagement with the community. And the point that Dom makes about risk-taking, well, it's obvious. governments have to become increasingly more attuned to a willingness to take risks. Because if we don't take risks, the certainty is that we won't do anything that pushes the envelope. And when the world is out there pushing the envelope, asserting themselves in terms of their trade strategies and in terms of the way that they produce improved levels of productivity, then we will ultimately flounder and become an also-ran nation. So we have to take risks, and politicians have to be prepared to say, this was what we thought was the best way to do it. It hasn't worked out that way, but we think we've learned from the experience and we move on.
Thank you. I mean, I think that, and being up close to the New South Wales scenario, living in Sydney, I can certainly get a sense that, you know, you do take chances and you're very consistent in how you think about your mandate and delivering on that. So, and I'm sure Victoria's exactly the same. So I certainly can see you walking the talk, if that makes sense. I was really excited this morning when I woke up to think that I was going to get to host these two gentlemen today, and then I went downstairs after going for a quick walk and opened the paper, and I saw that I was actually going to be hosting the Beatles version 2.0, so that was even more exciting. But not sure who's read the paper, but it was a good quote from Tim at yesterday's lunch. But so what I wanted to ask you both about the vision, and we have talked also on the last day or so about what we're going to look back to, and you mentioned it before, Dominic, around you'll be judged on the next 20 or 30 or 40 years. So 10 years down the path, you know, we're back here in 10 years' time. In Beatles parlance, is it going to be, you know, here comes the sun, or is it going to be help, or is it going to be yesterday, or what's the vibe going to be, or what's the feeling going to be in what you've delivered over your time with your mandate, particularly as it's a very strong mandate post the elections, looking back in 10 years' time?
Well, I think it'll be here comes the sun. I mean, if you look at our last, when we went to election this year in March, and really New South Wales was under construction, and we hadn't opened many of those projects. And I look at, and that helps, I think, politically, when you've got, with our Northwest Metro, which just opened, which is really opening up the northwest of Sydney. That's a project that we commenced when we came to office in 2011. But it's also looking at the next wave of opportunities and challenges that we need to get in front of. Now, Sydney and broader New South Wales is growing, and we need to make sure as it grows well. And we're setting up a 3 cities vision, which is well underway. And the optimism, particularly in Western Sydney, continues to grow. We've got to make sure that the investments in infrastructure that we make are ones that continue to drive economic opportunities and growth across our state. But I also think in terms of our vision, and I think you spoke earlier about the importance of New South Wales and Victoria going well. When our states go well, our country goes well. And one of the things that Tim and I have focused on particularly has been how do we build a better federation. And that's something that I certainly want to focus on over the next period of time that we're in these roles, because I think the blame game between Canberra and the states needs to end. And certainly we're going to have a perspective, and the Commonwealth's going to have a perspective. But it is, we as probably the 2 leading states and as states as important in the Federation, we can't just sit there and be passive. We need to play an active role in strengthening our Federation. And we've done that through the establishment of the Board of Treasurers in terms of financial agreements and arrangements, but in terms of reform opportunities. It's the reason I think a lot of these reforms don't get off the ground is that you have a Commonwealth that comes up with a theory, the states that sit there and say this is too politically challenging, and you reach a deadlock, rather than actually the states realising that we have an important obligation in making our country stronger, looking at those reforms, working together across the political divide, and going to the Commonwealth and saying, well, here is what we'd like to do. You know it's a good idea, but how can you help provide assistance to us to get these reforms over the line?
And the Board of Treasurers, Tim, it's 12 months down the track or so, had its first birthday. So how are you feeling about the outcome, and what's going to change, or what would you change in that forum to make it even more effective if you could?
Well, I'm pretty happy with the way it's operating, I've got to say, and full credit for Dominic for at least being prepared to actively agitate and argue for this, and he had to do a lot more of the heavy lifting on establishing this body than I did because, well, he had to tell the Treasurer at the time, Scott Morrison, that we thought we were going to set up a forum that wouldn't include the Commonwealth. But please don't take it personally. I think he did a very good job. And
Likes it now.
It's working really well, quite frankly. I mean, the thing I really like about this forum is we're not sitting around talking about things that we actually can't influence all that much, and that's how the Commonwealth perceives the states and what they're going to do. We can always, of course, form a lobby group, and lobbying is very important, and quite frankly the fact that we've got a legislated no disadvantage guarantee in the new recast GST arrangements is probably worth billions to the states, but it was something that wasn't going to be forthcoming until we pretty much well got every state on the same page with regard to it. But a lot of good policy work, a lot of hard effort is going in where people are thinking about where do they want to be, what can we do better, what learnings can we share. It's got an agenda that's quite substantial by contrast to, say, I don't know, a CFFR agenda, which seems to be quite often just perfunctory. We're there and we're out within an hour, and whatever has to be done is done. But you know, what we have is a forum where colleagues who deal with the same problems day to day get to share learnings, and very rarely, if ever, have we ever had a political argument.
And I think if you look at it, I mean, the CFFR agenda, and I certainly felt this the first time I went to one as a Treasurer back in 2017, is that you generally as a state get picked off one by the Commonwealth when it comes to financial agreements and the like. But I think this body has enabled us to learn more about the different challenges that other states and territories have. It's been incredibly vital, as Tim said, in terms of staying strong in negotiating better outcomes for our states with the Commonwealth, not because we want a handout, but because we believe that the policies that we had were more important. The GST, getting that no disadvantage clause, was an important one for us, but also through health agreements, I think, which are currently being negotiated, we can drive better outcomes. But I think the next test of this body, and I think one thing is being defensive in negotiating financial agreements, but is actually using this body with the states that are interested in driving opportunities for reform and being proactive rather than just reactive to agreements that come our way.
So Dom's done such a good job in advocating for a collective focus of the states that we're thinking of making him our shop steward.
Well, I think I was in the SDA when I had my first job at Pizza Hut when I was 14, and I think half my $5 went to the SDA. So I didn't rejoin.
So you wake up in the morning as state treasurers, and again important state treasurers. And what is on your mind as to the thing you really want to change? What's the thing that worries you the most when you wake up in the morning?
Well, from my way of thinking, it's things I can't control. Amusingly, there's this old saying that you should never spend time worrying about the things that you can't control and just attend to the things that you can. But by and large, I think when you can control something, you make the effort, you identify it, and you engage in both a policy sense and a practical way to try and get those problems sorted. It's when headwinds come in that are not necessarily capable of being sorted. And can I say, I said yesterday, I think there are some economic headwinds that are rapidly becoming apparent in the Australian economy and the world economy, more notably. We are seeing, of course, trade tension having a profound effect upon the performance of both the Chinese and the US economies.
Have you seen that in Victoria yet, Tim?
Yeah, we are. I mean, if you look at the last national account figures, you'll see that the consumption numbers have dropped down, and when consumption drops, the size of the GST pool drops and the revenue base for the state fall away. Whilst employment remains pretty strong, hours worked are dropping, and that probably will go to a payroll tax implication as well. And in the property market, last couple of weeks, we've seen property prices in Melbourne come up by about 1%, but still that's down from about 11%, a drop of 11% back from the high of November 2017. And the volumes are still down about 30%, and that really goes to state revenue. That's stamp duty that's not being realised for the state. So there are some challenges there, there's absolutely no doubt, and of course the challenge for Dom and I really is to keep our nerve in terms of being able to continue to make those vital infrastructure investments and service improvements that growing economies and increasing population centres are going to insist as a prerequisite of good government.
Well, there's probably two aspects to it, Damon. I think there's no doubt there are fiscal challenges coming our way, and our revenue base, the same challenges in New South Wales as in Victoria, particularly if you look at property consumption down, so our GST, there's pressures there. And so making sure that we have that strong fiscal discipline day in, day out in the state is important. But one of the things I think that I'm certainly focused on as well is you've got the day-to-day, but you've got setting up for the future and the vision and making sure that where we're investing is going to provide greater opportunities down the track. And one of the things we've changed in the government structure, and our Chief Economist Stephen's here for this conference, has been to get Treasury to have, yes, maintain that focus on the budget and that fiscal discipline, but also let's look at greater opportunities to drive economic growth in our state. And we want to be ahead of the curve when these challenges come our way. And that means you can't, I mean, one of the things governments do is it's like they only find the opportunity to act or have the political appetite to act once the foundations and the challenges are approaching. Now, the private sector doesn't act that way. They're looking 10, 20 years down the track and getting in front of it. You take, for example, in New South Wales, one of the biggest challenges we have at the moment is the drought. About 96% of the state is in drought, and it takes a drought for then the government to be sitting there saying, well, we need to do A, B, C, and D, rather than, well, what are we doing for, yes, it's going to rain again, but there's going to be another drought. What are we doing to set up the state? So invest in the infrastructure today, so the next time this challenge occurs, we're ahead of it. From our perspective as well, you talk about the trade wars. Well, what are the risks to the New South Wales economy going into the future? Where are the overseas jurisdictions that we should be betting on? Where should we be diversifying the economy? Where are the focuses that we should be having? That means there's winners and losers. But if you take we talk about the trade war, one of our biggest exports is in education. How much are we focused on China with education? Where are the other opportunities for New South Wales, and what can we do? What can we be doing now to opening up those doors, those channels of communication, and selling our state to the world?
I'd like to ask you about education and skills development, but I also want to give you both the chance, and I'm sure question time will probably raise this as well, around infrastructure, because I know both of you have an amazing amount of work happening and planned to happen. Are there any key issues you think the audience should know about the infrastructure programs that you're both undertaking that are relevant to call out?
Oh, well, I suppose that we're doing a lot collectively. If you look at the average 10-year spend on infrastructure in Victoria, before the government came to office, it was about $4.9 billion a year. This year, it's likely that is the forthcoming budget. It's likely to triple that 10-year average infrastructure spend. So, and that's only core government infrastructure spending. If you look at whole of government infrastructure spend, it's $107 billion in 1 year, commencing and ongoing capital investment from whole of government. And that sort of puts into context the $100 billion that Josh Frydenberg said he was going to spend in the nation over the next 10 years. And really, the point I make is not a churlish one, because we do actually see real value in working positively with the Commonwealth. It's more about saying there is a lot happening here, and the most important thing that we can do together is get on the same page and work cooperatively to get good outcomes. And I think increasingly that's becoming apparent, that now that the electoral cycle's behind us in both the federal government, New South Wales and Victoria, we get this pretty rare opportunity to have a crack and see whether we can actually have a legacy for the nation, and that is put the politics behind and get on and deliver.
Well, I've got to add to that. I mean, the Prime Minister came out recently and he spoke about he wants to support states who build stuff. Well, we're certainly building stuff in New South Wales, and we're building, if you make the point about $100 billion over 10, we're doing $90 billion, over $90 billion over the next 4 years. And I go back to that point about 2015, we went to polls and wise to unlock that capital to build infrastructure. People at the time said it wouldn't drive that economic growth, and that was at a time when the economy was going well nationally, was going well in New South Wales. Wasn't as soft as it is today, but that public investment in infrastructure is adding about half a percentage point to our economic growth. About 60% of the engineering work in New South Wales is being commissioned by the public sector, and about 75% of that work is being undertaken by the private sector. So when we're seeing a softening in the property market, as we are in Melbourne and in Sydney, you are seeing now a whole lot of the public investment in construction really picking up the slack in that space. So if we're talking about challenges in economic growth for states and the nation going forward, what's the number one thing we can be doing? Continuing to invest in productive infrastructure that will drive, so it's making sure we get the infrastructure investment right, so we're putting it in the right areas. But where I think we can have a greater collaboration with the federal government is getting that support and having a greater coordination of sequencing, greater understanding of financial arrangements and agreements on projects that we believe are the ones that the state should be building. And my view is there needs to be a greater understanding of who's responsible for what. And in my view, the federal government should be responsible for those interstate major infrastructure projects, or ones that affect our, really drive our national growth, on airports and ports and the like. That's where their interest should be. But then to bring back initiatives to help drive reform in the states, like the asset recycling incentive, which they had previously, to help drive reform so states can be motivated, more motivated. I mean, we will do it anyway, but it'd be great to see other states take the lead to drive that infrastructure investment. And I think the Commonwealth, rather than being focused on roundabouts and car parks as they get distracted by, particularly around election periods, to be open to communicating with the states about what are the infrastructure needs. You're closest to the challenges that your state has. How can we assist you in financing that infrastructure going forward? And I think everyone, with the Reserve Bank Governor, the World Bank, the IMF, they're all saying, what should sub-sovereign jurisdictions do to help economic growth? It's build infrastructure. So to have that greater relationship with the federal government of support, I think would benefit not just our states, but the country as a whole.
And looking future around the funding of infrastructure, because again, I think you've both been very, very successful at the asset recycling conversation and bringing funding back that can be then redeployed. But I'd be interested to get your sense of what you think the best future model is for funding infrastructure. It may be what it has been done, it may be something different.
We're always open to new ideas and innovative ideas, and partnering with the private sector where possible to build infrastructure for public benefit. And you can't be closed-minded to any approach. And through our unsolicited proposals system in New South Wales, we are open to innovative solutions that the private sector might have, that we in the government might have that expertise in delivery. Having said that, from the financing side as well, I think we're in a very strong position when it comes to using a balance of asset recycling to unlock capital, to build future infrastructure, but as well as to borrow at this time when the price of debt is cheap. Our net debt position is negative at the moment, but it goes to $38 billion over the next 4 years. So in the last year of the 4, but that's still 5% percentage of GSP. So we're in a very strong position, I think, to be. If there's a time to be borrowing to build infrastructure as a state level, it's now, but at the same time, not in isolation. I think continuing to use asset recycling, not as an end to itself. You don't, if it's the right thing to do that's going to get a better service delivery at a better price to taxpayers, but unlock capital that can be invested in future infrastructure, I think that approach has served our state well, and we'll continue to look at those opportunities as they come.
And from my point of view, I think it's horses for courses. You shouldn't just put all your eggs in one basket in terms of resourcing your infrastructure delivery. Of course, there's times when you use a government balance sheet. Sometimes you do it by running healthy surpluses and drawing down on those surpluses to help you build infrastructure. And my last budget shows that we're running surpluses around about $3.3 billion a year going forward. But on top of that, you need to look at the efficient use of debt. I don't think there's anybody who runs a business who thinks that running at zero debt is a smart way to utilise money, because you ultimately become inefficient in terms of how you value that money and you apply it, especially at a time at the moment that we're talking at the moment where borrowing is so historically low. We were pretty clear before the last election as a state government. We said that we would double the profile of state debt, and we sought a mandate to be able to do that. In doing that, we said we'll only spend that money on 3 projects. North East Link, a further 25 level crossing removals, and our share of the Melbourne Airport rail link. And in the last budget, I applied the funds to do exactly that. So with that said, I think the point that Dom makes about PPPs and our openness to engage with the private sector, to recognise that the model has to be one that's constantly varying and altering, and it has to alter because market conditions change, the appetite for risk between government and the private sector are very much real and apparent to us, particularly in the current environment. So getting that right, I think New South Wales and Victoria, the 2 jurisdictions in the world, with the possible exception of maybe a Canadian province or 2, that are the world leaders in public-private partnerships. We've got something like 33 PPPs under management or underway, worth about $38 billion in Victoria. So there's a lot going on. And on the issue of asset recycling, it's worked positively for the state of Victoria. I think we're getting to the point where we don't think there's much capacity for further privatisation of assets, but all that means is we've got to find new ways to engage the private sector in unleashing value from our balance sheet so that we can do more with public assets.
We're just about to take a break, but just before we do, I did want to test, and I know, Dom, you've been quite vocal around sort of federal-state relations, and I think you might have suggested it was a little bit of a mess, that sort of interaction, that nexus between the two. And I know last year, Tim, you made a comment which you reminded me of earlier, that states get things done and federal governments sit back and pick the lint out of their belly button. So what are your general comments on where it's at today, and how does it go forward?
Well, I mean, if you look at, I think the relationship in many ways is not broken, but it's in serious need of a service. And we have over 50 financial agreements with the federal government. 27 of those are less than $10 million. I think 8 are less than $1 million. I mean, I can imagine the bureaucracies built up around servicing those agreements. And that's why in this year's budget, I set up a panel chaired by David Thodey to look at federal financial relations from a New South Wales perspective, and to provide advice to us, which we will take to both the Board of Treasurers and to Josh Frydenberg on here are the opportunities where we think will make a more efficient financial system between both the states and the Commonwealth, and I have a one-size-fits-all policy, which is generally the mindset, I think, of Canberra, to give greater autonomy and flexibility to states to innovate. And I accept completely that, given the vertical fiscal imbalance that we have, that the Commonwealth is naturally going to want to make sure, when they're handing over funds, that they're getting bang for the buck, that the states are using those funds in an efficient way. But at the same time, I think there needs to be a shift some way to providing greater autonomy and flexibility for the states, which will improve competition, it will improve risk-taking, and at the same time, I think provide better outcomes between for states going into the future, and that's only going to make our country stronger down the track. So I'm confident that, I think this is one of the biggest challenges that we have over this term. I said yesterday that I think this is the one chance in the next 60 years where we've we've had a Commonwealth, Victorian and New South Wales elections in a very short period of time. So the opportunity for economic reform and financial reform is now, and we as states have an obligation to not just sit back, but to actively participate in that and get some reform up.
Well, Damien, I think I said 3 years ago that I'm getting old, tired and cynical, and when you hear politicians talk about productivity reform, the first thing you should ask is, well, what are you bringing to the table? That's why I've so enjoyed working with Dominic, because he actually accepts that before we start kicking back on the Commonwealth, we actually have to be prepared to make some choices and get our act together, and that's what the Board of Treasurers is about. But it's also a broader thing about recognising that if we're talking about the long term, the big play, rather than the next year or two, it will require us to have an engagement that goes beyond the political, and that's why having a state Labor government and a state Liberal government come together and say, well, let's try and find a way to work with the Commonwealth government is important. I do get a little irritated about Canberra, I've got to say. I mean, I was waxing lyrically about Lennon and McCartney the other day, and the great song that John Lennon wrote, Imagine. And I thought, imagine there's no Canberra. It's easy if you try. No wingless bureaucrats telling the states how to fly. And the thing that does irritate me is this instant expertise you get out of Canberra on things that they really don't have much expertise on. Dom is absolutely right. The Commonwealth has a right to insist that states effectively utilise the funds that they're given, both in terms of transparency, but in terms of meeting the targets and the aspirations that they set for themselves. But far too often, what we're starting to see is the Commonwealth saying, well, look, for our small contribution, you won't get it at all unless you do exactly as we say for everything. And look, those days are gone. We're not going to do it anymore. We're not going to be pushed around by the minor shareholder in the service delivery equation. But that doesn't mean that we're going to be belligerent. What we need to do is to find a basis under which we can respect each other's roles and responsibilities and get out and deliver real things into our communities.
Thanks, gentlemen. We're going to take a break now for a bite to eat, so we'll let you sit down. But please remember, get your questions together and feel free to do it via the app, or we will have some mics after lunch as well when we come back to the stage. So thank you. Great, we've got a question here. Thank you. And again, please just introduce yourself briefly.
Thanks, Pradeep Phillip. Just a question. It seems that there seems to be an economic strategy here coming out of Canberra, which seems to imply there's not much room on monetary policy for us to take action. We've got to build and preserve a surplus. Therefore, really, the only way you get stimulation in the economy must be through infrastructure, in particular through the states. And we've now got New South Wales and Victoria getting close to capacity. And so we need to think about how we unlock private sector investment. So a question to both of you is, one, how do we unlock greater capacity in the states for infrastructure? And second, what can we do to unlock greater private sector investment?
Thanks, Pradeep. I think the first thing I'd say is we can't keep looking at just the big projects. If we're talking about the time is right economically for some counter-cyclical investment to generate growth, and quite frankly our infrastructure projects in Victoria have now assured that 1 in 10 Victorians are employed in the construction industry. Our own capital spend alone has created 117,000 jobs, and in 4.5 years the employment growth in the state's grown close to 500,000 people. So A lot is going well, and I think it's a demonstrated course of action that if you invest in infrastructure, you ultimately improve the functionality and efficiency of your economy, but also you provide jobs and opportunity for people. The challenge for us then is, do we keep therefore doing bigger projects? Obviously, we've got a big range of projects and a big backlog. My view is that we need to chase much further down the range of value that's being provided here, and not so much the first and the second tier constructors, but look what's happening below that in the third tier and beyond. And that means recognising that the thing that's not particularly attractive to politicians, filling a pothole, or recognising that small community facilities being built, these are important because they will make a difference in terms of growth, but they'll have a long-term economic value. So I'm not advocating that we should now all sit down and come up with another really big thing that we should build. I'm saying that if people recognise, as I believe, the economy is starting to soften, and you're right, we're at the end of monetary policy for all intents and purposes, and I think we're absolutely at a point where we can say that to ask the states to continue to throw more into infrastructure, particularly at the top end, that big transport infrastructure stuff, you will get a law of diminishing returns start to apply, and you'll pay a heck of a lot more for a heck of a lot less going forward. So how do we overcome that? Start thinking about what are the small things that we can do and we can get out the door quickly.
I mean, the only thing I'd add to that, and agree completely, is that, you know, when we're asked to build infrastructure at a time where there's a lot of infrastructure actually going on. If you go back to 2011, when we started on our infrastructure projects in New South Wales, at the time you'd get Tier 1 firms, the best project teams, at a very good price. Now with obviously New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland coming on as well, there's a lot more heat in the market, particularly at that level. So we will, when you're spending $90 billion over the next 4 years, there's not so much, to Tim's point, you can do over that you're actually going to continue to get good value for money, and you don't want to build the infrastructure for the sake of it. You've got to make sure that it's not like we're on a deadline as we were when we were having the Olympic Games in 2000, when there are constraints and there's heat in the market, we've got to be able to sequence these projects in a way, particularly not just within our own state, but also interstate, to make sure we're getting the best teams and the best price for our taxpayers. And if that means that at a various point in time we need to adjust timelines, we should be open about doing that. Having said that, I agree with Tim that there's smaller projects at the Tier 2, Tier 3 levels that we could be driving as well, and whether that's with maintenance, pinch point programs, which, yeah, they aren't as sexy announcements for politicians to get up and cut ribbons on, but they are just as important and can be just as important in easing congestion and making better, getting better infrastructure outcomes whilst they might be smaller projects. And that's probably where the federal government, we talk about the federal government giving us greater support for our major projects like Metro West. They might want to give extra support for maintenance, but if on either account, if they gave us greater support for Metro West, that would then alleviate other capacity within the state to be driving those areas in maintenance and smaller pinch point programs that have a significant impact on communities, but also continue to drive the economy by having those smaller teams and smaller projects, and some of which in our regions, to get them moving as well, I think is important.
We have a question just from the app that I think is an important one, so I'll just refer to that, but keep thinking about your questions from the floor. So this one relates to thoughts on fostering university and TAFE and delivering the skill shortage or the skill gaps that we're seeing. And I know that there's been a huge amount of thinking and investment support for vocational training across both states, but gentlemen, what would you like to comment on around how the state's thinking around education and that skills gap?
Yeah, look, there's been a discussion around division of responsibilities between the federal and states, particularly when it comes to education. So you've got a situation where childcare and early childhood education is split between the states and the Commonwealth. I don't think that's efficient. I think we had productive discussions a couple of years ago with the Commonwealth in relation to higher education and whether the federal government could potentially play a greater role in that space. But I think Tim agrees on this point, that it's probably the states who know what are the areas where we need to be driving skills in our own jurisdictions, where are the needs that we need to be focusing on, and that's probably best left in the ambit of the states. One of the things that we've been doing in our state, and we kind of copied Victoria, was working out where those skills were that we needed in our own jurisdictions, and started to offer fee-free apprenticeships, free courses to drive growth in those areas, knowing that they were the key sectors that we thought we had a deficiency in and needed that support going forward. But there's a lot of reform, I think, in that TAFE higher education space that both states would be looking at.
And I think Dom's really summed it up. I mean, you shouldn't feel in any way guilty about knocking off an idea from Victoria. We spend a lot of time looking to knock off good ideas from New South Wales, and I think that's when the Federation works best, when states come up with good ideas and populate it as standard practice around the system. So with the free TAFE system, we identified 30 areas in TAFE courses where the community needed these jobs and skills to come through, and whether it be in construction industry or in healthcare, childcare, we saw that there was an evident need. There was going to be jobs for the long term, and if we didn't provide for that skill base, then we were ultimately going to pay a price. So certainly from our perspective, free TAFE seems to be working quite well. It's almost double the number of uptake in those courses. Practically speaking, it means that we no longer have to hope that our recruitment external to the state, or the migration of skills that might come into the state, will give us the gift that we can keep on doing the things that are really core services of the state. So that's important. We've also started to introduce a Year 13 in high school, which is about making sure that you have a capacity for people to get a long way into an apprenticeship before they're released into formally into a workforce, so that they can essentially get the education system helping them through. And finally, we've also spent a lot of time starting to talk to the universities about how we might interact TAFE and undergraduate degrees, so that we can get students freeing up within the same time frame of undertaking an undergraduate degree the opportunity to do a TAFE diploma as well. Because what we know is your employability is massively improved if you have a TAFE diploma. And having studied an arts degree at one stage here at ANU, I realised that you do have a little bit of time on your hands, and I'm very much a Renaissance man, and I think people should broaden their horizons, but maybe getting a bit of focus about what you want to do in your career post your graduate degree is important as well.
Anything? Thank you.
Hello, Sarah Davidson from Chartered Accountants. Thank you, Treasurers, for your panel discussion. I'm interested to know a little bit more about the reforms you might be able to drive, the proactive reforms through the Board of Treasurers, particularly ones that might involve cooperation between the federal government and states, and what role business leaders and other peak bodies might be able to contribute to assist with that advocacy. I particularly had in mind, firstly, challenging areas like the increasing the base and rate of GST, but also potentially other areas like rollout of infrastructure in regional areas, particularly, for example, digital connectivity to fill gaps where NBN is not covered. Thank you.
Look, I think what you don't want to do when you're embarking on reform is have ideas killed off before they start. And one of I think if you look at some of it's very easy for both sides of politics to play a scare campaign when it comes to reform. And I think if you look at some of the more substantive reforms that governments have taken to elections, the opposition at that time has always opposed that substantive reform purely, in my view, on political grounds. Whilst it was the right thing to do, it was a great opportunity to put the counter-argument to run a scare campaign to ensure that that reform fails. So one of the aspects of the Board of Treasurers that I think is most vital, which we touched on earlier, is by getting both sides of politics to work together on embarking on reform that can make a real difference without and in some way mitigating the impact of the political attacks that will come from it. So if you have a Liberal government in New South Wales with a reform that is supported by a Labor government in Victoria that is hopefully facilitated and assisted by a Liberal Commonwealth government, I think that gives us a greater certainty to be able to take the community with us. In terms of the business, so I don't think whether it's the GST, whether it's income tax sharing, whether it's a change of the taxation base of the states and working in eliminating more inefficient taxes into the future, I think there's a role the states can play, but there's also an important obligation of the Commonwealth to not just sit there, but help facilitate states be successful on those reforms. So if you take that asset recycling incentive that they put on the table, they didn't have any skin in the game. They put some money on the table, but the political risk was with the states to move. And I think that is a approach that they can continue in other areas. If you look at the Productivity Commission's report, a lot of the areas for driving productivity growth in this country are now wholly located within the jurisdictions of the states. So it's easy for the federal government, and I think I'm on a KIFR agenda coming up, there's an item at the top on productivity. I'm assuming, and I'd be surprised if it's not the case, that the federal government will be sitting there saying, well, here's some productivity ideas, and you states should be doing it. Well, what role can the federal government play in assisting the states who'll be taking on that political challenge in embarking on that reform? Not for the sake of it, but if that reform is the right thing to do, there will come a cost. And the way the federal financial relations sit at the moment, if states reform certain areas, the more efficient they become, the less revenue they get from the Commonwealth. So it's counterintuitive in many ways for states to embark down this path if they're not actually incentivised to do it. In terms of the business community, I think that's a very important point when it's in relation to any reform. It's hard for politicians to drive an agenda if there's no constituency out there supporting them. And I think the business community can play a vital role in being vocal about the fact that states and Commonwealth jurisdictions that are embarking on reform have the support across a broad spectrum of the community being there, and you know, I think people will trust outside voices more so than politicians. So to have that constituency supporting what governments are embarking on, I think is vital if we are going to get any substantive reform over the line.
Do you want to add anything, Tim?
Oh, not really. I thought Dom summed it up pretty well. I mean, one brief observation I'd make is when you change things, you also change the way that the economy operates and sometimes where revenue comes in. So if you look, for example, at the lease of the Port of Melbourne, a classic illustration, we converted what was effectively a dividend yield provider to the state of Victoria, that is revenue coming into us, into a company tax paying institution that provided a windfall for the Commonwealth. So when people talk about asset recycling being some gift that the Commonwealth's giving the states, it's not. I mean, it's basically them recognising that they're the beneficiaries in many cases for our effort.
I'm sure you'd agree it's been another bromance episode, but a quick question for me, and we will have to wind up in a few minutes, so please, if there's any last questions people want to ask from the floor. But what don't you agree on? What things don't you agree on?
Our footy teams?
Relations?
Yeah, no, I told Dom it was surprising that he was a Minister for Industrial Relations and Treasurer, and so was I. And I said, I suspect you're probably having a better time of it than I am at the moment. It's hard when you've got those two responsibilities, particularly from a Labor government point of view, and I don't say that with any degree of relish. It's just that it's harder. I mean, the people you have to look across the table to and tell them they can't have what they want, well, they're people that I have very close working relationships with. So, but at the end of the day, you have to recognise that our responsibility is to the welfare of the citizens of our respective states, and we have to call it as we see it.
I mean, obviously, where we differ is that I'm the Treasurer of the best state in the country. And even though he was born in New South Wales, he fled to Victoria. Look, I think it's really important that you have competitive federalism, because I think that makes a stronger country where you are looking at ways of beating the other. I'd love to build a wall between New South Wales and Victoria. But at the end of the day, I think where we sit today, and I think if you look at the past, there needs to be a greater focus on collaborative federalism. And as Tim has said, there's a lot we can learn from each other, and that's what's certainly come through the Board of Treasurers, and there's a lot that we can, I think, support the Commonwealth on. I mean, if you look at areas like Service New South Wales, which we set up, I think they're following that with Services Australia, and that's something where we've revolutionised service delivery in our state and broken down those barriers and silos that operate in governments, and turn that experience that people from New South Wales in the room would remember when you rocked up to renew your licence and you'd get the wrong ticket and you'd have to take a day off work and you'd be grunted at behind the bulletproof glass from that angry person who'd probably been on a smoko for half the morning, to now being met. You're right, I've got 6 kids, but if you've got kids and you've seen the movie Zootopia, there's this great scene where they've got these sloths serving at the DMV. Well, that's what it was like at the RTA in New South Wales for forever and a day. But now you rock up there, and this is the role of government: primary responsibility, service delivery. Why are we so poor at it? So to rock up and to be met by a concierge, to be in and out, to have a 98% satisfaction rating is pretty rare for government. So that's something that I think we have done incredibly well at a state level, and that's something we're sharing with other states and now sharing with the Commonwealth. And we need to do that because we've just launched, for example, a digital driver's licence in New South Wales, but it can't actually operate in other states unless they change their legislation. So there's a whole lot of things I think we can work together on, and I think the Board of Treasurers will drive that. But we are now at a time where, yes, I still get, and we sledge each other with text messages when the State of the States report comes out, and obviously we were winning for a while, but it's always good to give Victoria
5 consecutive quarters at number 1.
Yeah, but we were equal. It was actually one of the most frustrating parts of this year's budget, is that we had the lowest unemployment rate continuously in New South Wales, and I think the 2 days before the budget came out, Victoria levelled with us. But if you took it to a decimal point, we were still lower.
Isn't it sad he's got to argue with the umpire?
There is a great saying I was mentioning earlier to someone that, and it's one of the presidents, US presidents, said, it's amazing what you can accomplish if you don't mind who gets the credit. And I think obviously the Board of Treasurers has been an amazing collaboration. So I think we'd all very much congratulate you both on and Dom particularly, of establishing that forum, because it does sound like it's been amazingly productive in the conversation so far. We're going to have to wind it up there, unfortunately, and I will invite Diane Smith-Gander to the stage to give a vote of thanks.
What a fantastic way to finish. Look, we've heard a lot about voice this morning, and I'm sorry I wasn't able to join you yesterday, but last night, the voice of women's equality at CEW, the voice of CEDA across the public policy arena looking for improved economic development in Australia. And so let me say, in acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we have met, that I am very strongly in support of a voice, and a constitutionally enshrined one, for our First Peoples. Let me start out by thanking Damien and everybody at First State Super for their ongoing support of CEDA and this event in particular. Look, Damien, I think it's fantastic that you keep trying to promote these two treasurers. And I really think that CEDA could well support the notion that a term as a state treasurer should actually be required experience and precursor to any more senior office. So I'm very glad that you two gentlemen are going through that stage at the moment. It is so refreshing to hear the pair of you. Your perspectives are always long-term. They're always about risk-taking and the notion of collaboration to deliver a better federation. You know, no wonder that you both take a great deal of pride in being able to have such strong public-private partnerships in your states. And I do reflect on this, and why do you two present like this? You're so different to so many other politicians, and in a very good way, let me say. And I think it is because you are prepared to say that politicians are not immune from the trust deficit, that you are prepared to say that politicians just can't occupy the crease and do nothing. And you are prepared to say that there is a political divide, and it might look like a chasm, but boy, oh boy, it can actually be breached. So I can see you working together to try to improve the Federation. I can see the New South Wales Treasurer, he's the shop steward. He's explaining the need, why there has to be skin in the game from both sides. And then we've got the Victorian Treasurer. He's pointing out it's really uncomfortable to feel that the Federal Treasurer is just plucking the lint from the navel of Victoria. And he is reminding Canberra that it's possible to imagine a world without Canberra. So, haven't we had a lot of song titles over the last little while? So I am now going to thank you once again and invite CEDA's CEO, Melinda Salento, to come up and close the conference. But let me thank you all for the very warm reception that you have given to the notion that I'll be stepping into the CEDA chair as we move into November and our AGM. And look, I hope, gentlemen, that I can be as bold and as insightful in my term as you have been in your term as treasurers and today. And I'm wondering, Melinda, do you think we can get away with our song being Girls Just Want to Have Fun?